Hello, World History. This one is for you who are studying the War on Terror and an event in the Cold War that informs us about our current war on terror. And so what we're looking at the Cold War is the Soviet invasion and war in Afghanistan. And there's a video on YouTube I shared with you. There's also in the book on page 987. This is about the Soviet invasion and war in Afghanistan. I can give you the cause, courses, and effects. And then here is our page where you write the editorial. And there are sort of three parts on Monday today. You're researching the historic event, the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Then we'll briefly research the current war on terror. And then you're going to share your thoughts about how the event from the past should guide our thinking about the present problem. Now, you're not going to solve the war on terror, but you can provide insight and reasoning using this historic example of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so today, aside from the research you do, this video is, I'm going to share my notes with you and also put it up in a PDF about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the war there. And so here I have the course, the Soviet invasion and war in Afghanistan. Here I have a bit of a background, causes, effects, and some lessons learned. Okay, so Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the war. It's roughly from 1979 to 1987. Some say 1978 to 1989. Either one of those work. There are different dates and that have to do with that. There's one side during this, so think of it as a civil war in Afghanistan, but there are other groups that are involved in this conflict. So on one side, you have the USSR, along with Afghan communists, the Afghan communist government, and people who live in the cities, the urban centers, versus the tribal leaders, so the rural tribal leaders of Afghanistan, Islamic fundamentalists, and the United States arms, meaning weapons, and funding and money is on this side. So we've got USSR versus the tribal leaders. And this side ends up defeating the USSR over the course of this costly and bloody war. The effects of this are 15,000 Soviet dead, 20 billion spent by the USSR. This leads to the breakup of the Soviet Union, along with other factors, but this causes their economy, along with trying to compete with the United States and their missile program. This drains them of blood and treasure. It leads to the breakup of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe by 1989 and 1990. 1 million Afghanis died in this conflict. 1 million, again, a hard number to wrap your head around, as well as 5 million Afghanis displaced, people forced out of their home. Another effect of this is that the United States supported the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen are the Islamic fundamentalist freedom fighters who are fighting against the communists. And we supported these Islamic radicals who later would turn into the Taliban, and also including Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who was on the side that the U.S. was supporting against the Soviets, and so who would later turn on us and plan the 9/11 attack from Afghanistan. We had supplied money and arms to fund to fight against the Soviets. So I put this up here. This is just to get you a sense of why Afghanistan is considered important. It's geopolitically important. If you go all the way back, if you go like a far background, during imperialism, we looked at the Great Game, which was Russia and Britain competing for Afghanistan. Britain used to control India, which during the time of imperialism was both India and Pakistan were India. And so in between was Afghanistan, and the British controlled this, and the Russians and British were fighting over Afghanistan, this buffer state. Well, you fast forward to the Cold War, to the 1970s, India's been broken up into Pakistan, which is a Muslim nation, and India, the Hindu nation. You've got Afghanistan, also primarily Muslim, Iran, primarily Muslim as well. And here's the USSR, and the many republics that make up the USSR. These are their Muslim-dominated republics of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. And so they're right on the border of Afghanistan as well. And as we see, the USSR keeps trying to get more influence. They have influence in Eastern Europe, and they want to get more influence in Central Asia. And so is one of the reasons for the USSR invading Afghanistan. They want to control this important piece of territory that they've controlled for years. Also, Iran right here is a source of incredible oil wealth. And so some of the causes of this, the USSR helps to orchestrate a coup, a seizure of power, a forcible seizure of power. And so there's a friendly Soviet government in Afghanistan, and they do what the USSR does when you make a communist government. They collectivize agriculture, and they also they give rights to women also, as well as create censorship and terror at the same time. But this flies in the face of some of the strong religious Muslims who live in Afghanistan who do not want to give rights or education to women, or the tribal warlords who also want to control area instead of it belonging to the government and collectivizing agriculture. In 1979, there's an Islamic revolution in Iran. So this used to be a U.S.-friendly country, and then there was a revolution against the Shah, against the person that the U.S. supported. And so in 1979, there's an Islamic fundamentalist revolution. And so the Soviets are worried about the spread of Islamic fundamentalism to Afghanistan. And so this is Islamic fundamentalist, and so they're worried about the spread of that into Afghanistan. There's also Islamic fundamentalism in Pakistan, and they're worried about the spread of that into Afghanistan too. Even though the United States are against the Islamic fundamentalists here, the United States ends up supporting the Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan because they're fighting against the Soviets. This is an example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so we support the Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan against the Soviet government. And the way we do that is with a new technology called Stinger missiles. And YouTube or Google up Stinger missiles. They're shoulder-fired missiles that can take down a helicopter. And helicopters were the primary weapon of choice for the Soviet Union. And look at some of the Soviet helicopters. They're enormous, they're huge gunships that would strafe the Afghanistan countryside. But once the United States started supplying Stinger missiles to the tribal leaders and they were called Mujahideen, the Islamic fundamentalists who were fighting, they'd use these Stinger missiles and they could take down a helicopter, and it was a game changer. After all was said and done, after these 10 years, 1 million Afghans dead, 15,000 Soviets dead, 30,000 wounded. Also, the Soviet army, similar to the U.S. war in Vietnam, many of the young men who went to fight in Afghanistan came back with PTSD, also with serious drug problems. Afghanistan is one of the world centers of opium and the heroin trade, and so they brought back opiate addictions to the USSR. That's another effect. And also, once this communist government leaves, you have a government that's now controlled by the warlords and eventually the Taliban, the Islamic fundamentalist government that was friendly to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Just write Al-Qaeda down. Al-Qaeda, which is the terrorist network, which perpetrated 9/11, as well as the war on terror first started against Al-Qaeda. It splintered into different groups and now is considered ISIS is one of the splinter groups. So what are some lessons from this war in Afghanistan? This is where empires fall. It's called the graveyard of empires. The British lost in Afghanistan. The Soviets lost in Afghanistan. And now the United States, we are still in Afghanistan. Since 2001, it's the longest war in U.S. history, 19 years. And we see that from this close to a decade interval that the Soviets spent in Afghanistan. It sunk them. Also, during a war, the enemy of my enemy is my friend during the war, but afterward, it becomes your enemy again. Think about this here. We saw the enemy of the Soviet Union as being these tribal leaders and the Mujahideen, and so they became our friend. We gave them funding. Later, after the Soviets are defeated, they turn on us and become our enemy. Think back to World War II. Remember, the United States allied with Stalin and the USSR in order to fight Hitler. Then after Hitler's defeated, the USSR and USA are enemies again. So another lesson is that violence begets more violence. There's a cycle of violence that continues after this is done. And also the effects of the population. They are going to be Afghanistan consistently over the last 30, 40 years has been the people of Afghanistan have been destroyed by these empires searching for geopolitical strategy to have power in this area with beauty and natural resources, but also pocked by violence and religious extremism and a deep-seated disdain and of outsiders and independence. And so the Soviet invasion and war in Afghanistan, and tomorrow we'll look at some of the current issues of the war on terror, and we can take some lessons from this war and apply them to our current situation. All right, thank you very much.